Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Journey with Dr. Dan podcast, where every journey is worth living. My name is Dr. Dan, and I'm your host for today's episode. I'm a bilingual neurolinguistic programming and cognitive behavior psychotherapist specializing in anger management issues, both court-appointed and private, marriage counseling using the EFT method, dissociative disorders, narcissistic personality disorders, depression, anxiety, dream analysis, and also provide life, business, and retirement coaching support. I provide individual one-on-one session in both French or English, and also do group settings. If you need any assistance, reach out to DMV Therapy and Coaching Services at 301-325-1550, and our website can be found at lifecoachdanamzalai.com. Today, I'm very excited to have for our fourth episode of season 16, a very special guest and toxic family expert and remediation advisor, Susan Gold. And I will now leave it up to the guests to properly introduce themselves, as no one can do a better job. Susan, the floor is yours.
First, Dr. Dan, thanks for the podcast you're producing. I just listened to the episode with Amy Norhughes. You're doing an incredible service to your listeners. And I'm so impressed with all your capabilities and your experience. So thank you. I am a first-time author. I did write a book called Toxic Family, Transforming Childhood Trauma into Adult Freedom. Never expected I would write a book, and that's actually not even my title. It was my publisher's title. I feel like it's been a magical illumination, and that was my original title. I grew up in a family of chaos, addiction, abuse of every sort, slathered through every cranny and crevice. And I'm grateful to say I didn't turn it inward, but I stepped up and got help and have transformed that trauma. And I'm here to help others with that same issue.
Thank you so much, Susan, for being a part of this podcast. And it is people like you and all the guests that I bring that I actually make a change into other people's life, because sometimes it's very hard for them to come out and admit what happened during their childhood. And then unfortunately or subconsciously, they bring all this trauma into adulthood. And that in return can cause more issues in their existing relationship, either personal or professional. And that creates a lot more toxic environment. So with your help, I'm sure that people will get inspired. They'll be able to move forward towards making a change. And like you said, stepping up. So tell me a little bit more about your story, Susan, about you mentioned something about the toxic environment when you were a child. How did you transition into getting the help that you needed to be able to not project the same toxic mentality as you had when you were young into when you are as you are an adult?
So I knew as a child something was horribly wrong. And I just had a very ebullient spirit and a dream and a belief that I would get out. And I did leave the morning after I graduated from high school. I didn't go back often. And it was in New York City in my early 20s that the red flags began to surface. My relationships were getting more and more abusive. It was argumentative. It was violent. It was traumatic. It was the same feeling that I had in my upbringing, and there were red flags everywhere. So I was lucky enough to surrender, say I needed help, because I didn't want to relive my past. I wanted to create a different present. And someone referred me to a therapist, and I was lucky enough to walk in and say, my life is totally out of control and completely unmanageable. And he immediately started talking about alcoholism. Was there alcoholism in my family? Did I drink? And I said, I don't understand why you're asking me these questions. I've got serious issues. But he was very insightful. I got sober immediately and learned about addiction and went on to learn about clinical depression. I was in the middle of two parties in a work project, and that echoed the role that I had played in my family, breaking up my parents' arguments and fights. I was 7 when I heard my mother pleading for her life. I opened my bedroom door in the night. I saw my father standing over my mother with a knife in his hands, and my mother on her knees begging for her life. And I screamed for them to stop and promptly passed out. And then here I was in my professional life, and it wasn't exactly the same, but it certainly brought up the feelings, the emotions, the emotional recall. and I went into a clinical depression, suicidal, split out of self. And I was lucky to have amazing friends and support that got me to a treatment center.
Wow. Do you feel, I mean, because in cases like that, as traumatic as you mentioned when you were that young, did you have any siblings that were also along by your side to be able to deal with the situation together, or you were the only child?
I was in the middle of five children. So I have an older brother, older sister, two younger brothers, and we each have a very different trajectory and experience having grown up in that home. The most violent abuse is between my oldest brother and myself,
Okay.
and he has almost no recall of his childhood.
Wow. Okay. Did you by any chance created some um multiple personalities, or they would call it now dissociative disorders, by any chance, just to be able to deal with the trauma at that given moment?
Thank you for asking that question. When I was four, I had a fake friend, and I used to always call upon the angels. The angels would help me. And I also had a baby blanket that I carried on
Okay.
for way too long, way past its expiration date, Dr. Dan. But I don't think that I had multiple personalities, but it is with one of my brothers. He suffers from schizophrenia.
Okay.
And I do believe my mother may have been suffering from that disorder. She was also soothing through food. And back then, diet pills were the answer for food compulsions and overeating. So she was on speed.
Oh,
And my father soothed through alcohol and womanizing. And he was also narcissistic.
oh God, this is a trifecta of hell, right? Having to deal with all this, definitely. So, when it comes to after your session with the therapist, did you feel a drastic change on how you see conflict in relationship, either personal or relation or professional?
Well, it took a long time to tease out the threads and dissect it. As you had implied earlier, it was terrifying to go back into that household and relive some of the traumas that I experienced with that therapist. But he was very bright, and I took instruction because I was beaten. And I had always been so focused and determined, can do no matter what. But it was a process. And yes, I learned boundaries. And more importantly, I learned what emotions were. By that time, I was so shut down. I was frozen. My heart was a blackened nub. And I was going through life like a chameleon, pretending, sensing what you may want from me, and then asserting and presenting that.
So do you feel that you were numb from any I mean, numb towards other people, either in loving relationship or any other sort? Did you feel that you had no presence, no loving presence towards the other person because of what happened in the past?
No, that's not true. I was a complete empath and could feel. I was highly intuitive. When I was a young child, I was telepathic. I could read the thoughts, and it kept me safe, and it kept me on the planet. But no, I had great empathy and great love. I just felt I had saran wrap around my being and couldn't really genuinely connect authentically. My trust had been broken.
So it was a constant battle in your mind because you had so much empathy, but yet you had to kind of like keep yourself protected from any of the external environment that may come back and haunt you like it did when you were a child.
Yeah, and it was not just involving my mind, it was involving my heart. And that's been an incredible journey to reclaim that piece of me, and especially that inner child that I believe rests there and has been my guide all the way along.
So are your parents still alive, or what
So
is
my mom unfortunately is not. She passed a while ago. My dad is still here. He's a genius astrophysicist.
wow.
Brilliant. And alive and kicking, and still as big of a kid as he was. I think he's 91.
91. And did you kind of rekindle the relationship with your dad after you start going through the therapy and realizing what was the breakdown of your family structure?
Yeah. So it came in pieces. I had projected most of the blame towards my mother because she was the more overt. My father's abuse was more covert. So I went through approximately a 3-year period with no contact with my mom. And my dad was more the hero. But then I started to see his mask and underneath that mask. So it's been decades of work, but the beauty is I have been able to come full circle and have compassion. They came from horribly abused backgrounds. It was hurt and abused children raising hurt and abused children. And that goes way back in the lineage.
So, how is your relationship now with your siblings, Susan? I mean, is it because sometimes when you all go through a very traumatic experience, you share something in common, which create a very strong bond between siblings. And in other cases, it may split them apart, especially if you decide to leave. They will all think that you abandoned them when you left after high school, and then they all feel very vulnerable. So, do you feel that this basically created more tension between the siblings, or it brought you all together?
I feel we've always had a bond, even though we've all had very different experiences. And I did a lot of work, particularly around the abuse between my oldest brother and myself, including, 2 years in a group, talking, writing, and actually having a conversation with him, confronting him and confronting the abuse with him. And we have love for each other, but I still have some PTSD that comes up when I'm around him. We don't have the opportunity to see each other often, but when we do, we're happy genuinely to see each other.
Are you in the same state of your as your brother, or you guys live ocean apart?
Yeah. So for quite a while, I was the only one out on the West Coast. Now a sister lives close to this way. She's in Idaho. I'm now in rural Montana.
Okay.
And then my oldest brother's in Canada. I have a brother in Ohio. And my other brother just moved to Ohio too. So yeah.
So is there any family reunion that you guys just get together by any chance, or is gonna be like World War III?
Dr. Dan, you're so intuitive. So there was a gathering last summer, and it was fun. And my dad loved it so much. He's scheduled another one for this August, so we'll all be together
Wow.
again. Yeah.
Also, have maybe a sense of telepathy. Who knows?
So it's so funny you brought that up.
I have a large family myself, so we have often family reunions. So that's why I said, when you have like 5 brothers or 5 siblings, I would say, yeah, chances are you all kind of figure out a way to be able to see each other at least once every decade.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what it's been up till this point.
So what, I mean, for our listeners, Suzanne, and I'm sure that your situation or your life is very, very similar to many of others who have gone through very traumatic or toxic family gathering and all. Well, not just gathering, but in their childhood. So what would you recommend for the most of them if they're still feeling resentment towards what happened in the past? How to overcome that, or how to past this moment and start kind of like letting go, not holding that grudge that they may hold for so long, and then start living their life.
Well, I respect them for their resentment, but what I found for myself was holding on to the anger, the rage, the injustice was like me eating rat poison and expecting my abuser, my challenger, my challenging situation to drop over. So it only was harming me ultimately. And again, doctor, this took a lot of work to get to this point of surrender. And then understanding the history of my abusers. I maybe it's Southern California, hooey, but I feel we've all come in with very specific objectives and a focus for this life trajectory. And I feel I was born into the perfect family for my desires and the perfect position within that family, the middle child of 5. And I feel it's been a gift. I respect my parents and their journey and the roles they've taken on, as well as my siblings. And it's been a process, but I see this as a huge chance for soul evolution if I'm willing to perceive it with new perspective. And that does take a lot of courage, and it breaks a taboo. I don't see it as me against you and I'm the victim and you're the perpetrator. I see it from a broader viewpoint.
And before your mother passed, were you able to build a connection with her again, or do you still feel that it was too much to handle?
So we spoke telepathically, and I didn't understand it until after she went, because I was speaking to her the same way when she was no longer on Earth. And that too may sound odd to some of your listeners, but we were very connected. It wasn't until I had my own child, and it was late in my adulthood, that I could really begin to have more compassion and understanding. I didn't always have trust. I knew my boundaries, but I could communicate and I could feel love for her. And she was a tremendous force of nature. I mean, what she was handling, she was horribly abused as a child. Her father was beaten by his stepmother almost to the point of death. It brought on psychotic episodes. They were foisted upon her. Her own mother was not allowed to show affection because his mother had passed away, and it caused great pain. He thought he was doing a service. He would beat my mother, and then she would have to pretend everything was okay. There was no discussion. And she'd also been molested by the parish priest.
Oh, wow. Are you concerned at times where historical mental illness can go down from one generation to the other, and you may have to deal with something similar to what your mom dealt with? And it seems like there's a vicious cycle occurring right now, as your mom being abused when she was a child, and then it happened to your family. And are you afraid that this could happen again?
Well, I can only speak for myself, not my siblings. I've had my own battles with mental illness, addiction, clinical depression. My first suicidal thought through was when I was 6 years old. I took a carving knife from the meat block and was purveying the blade with fascination, thinking if I could just lance this through my little heart, this would all be over. And then my mother came thundering through the kitchen, and I slammed that knife in the block quick and closed those doors. But I had suicidal depression off and on. In adulthood, was treated for 10 years, and I did use medication off and on to get to a level playing field. But I've done a tremendous amount of work, and including somatic work, Dr. Dan. That's really where the shift came for me. It was important to do the talk and get my story down and have a basic understanding. But what really created the neural pathways to open and me to change on a cellular level, and the pockets of trauma to begin to clear within my body, because that's where I carry the trauma, I really had to do inner work that was emotional and maybe more off the beaten path than the traditional talk therapy.
Have you ever tried NLP, neuro linguistic programming?
I have, and it's been of a tremendous benefit. I suffice it to say, had a stellar career matching celebrities to brands, and it helped me become a very accomplished producer in television and film. I was invited to Los Angeles for what I thought was a great career opportunity. But in hindsight, I see it was to meet one of the greatest teachers of my lifetime. And it was the man who would become my ex-husband. I was always told I was powerful. I was so independent. I was accomplished, but I didn't feel that inside, even after traversing everything I had. And I married one that I perceived to be a narcissist and didn't understand it. It was 13 years of being together before I really truly saw the mask fall. He also was from a very violent home, but had never had the opportunity to address it. He had created a false persona where there was none. And it was walking through that experience that everything, it was like perfect storm came in together, and all my years meditating and being on silent meditation retreat and work running marathons and triathlons and in other endurance sports, it all came together. And walking through that really taught me who I am as a powerful human being.
And when you saw the signs of narcissism, did it bring a direct recollection of how your dad was? And then you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together to say, oh my God, I married my dad?
It took a while, and I really wanted to keep that denial factor up. That marriage was so far past the expiration date, but I so wanted to win out. I mean, you come from a family, a broken family, an abusive family. You don't want your own to be, right? And he portrayed the perfect partner. That was the portrayal. So the chipping away took quite a while, but it didn't really become obvious until after we had a child of our own. And, I was carrying the weight. I bought the family home. I was paying the majority of the bills, and stepping up as the adult in the relationship. And yes, that was clearly the role my mother had played. She had married a Peter Pan. He couldn't show up as an adult. He was fun.